Well, greetings, brethren, and a special hello to all of you from the brethren down in South Louisiana. I want to discuss today a subject that I think is a very fundamental subject, and yet it's one that has been misunderstood by virtually all of the professing religions that claim to get their religion out of the Bible. It's a subject that the Pharisees, back in the days of Jesus Christ, totally misunderstood, didn't get the point at all. It's also a subject that modern professing Christianity doesn't understand at all. A subject the Catholics don't understand, the Protestants don't understand, and yet it is a very fundamental subject because it addresses the approach and the whole focus that we are to have in the Church of God that Jesus Christ established. And that I wish to focus our attention on today is the question of just what is the spirit of the law. What do we mean, the spirit of the law? Now, some people think the spirit of the law means you spiritualize away the law. And the law really, it just becomes sort of some fluff idea and you just have sort of good feeling in your heart. Well, is that what the Bible means when we're told that we are to be practicing the administration of the spirit of the law? Now, Jesus Christ made it very plain that the Pharisees totally misunderstood the spirit of the law. Now, in order to understand and to sort of set the stage for understanding the spirit of the law, what we're going to have to look at to begin with is a little bit of understanding the administration that we have in the New Testament church and how it differs from what existed under the Old Covenant. Under the Old Covenant, the Levitical priesthood was the administration of the Old Covenant that God had made with Israel at Mount Sinai. Now, we're told in the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, back down in verse 12 of Hebrews 7, for the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. A change of the law? What law changed? Well, the law of the priesthood. The things that pertained to the priesthood. It's made clear in Hebrews chapter 7 that we have a priesthood in the Church of God today. As we're told on down here in Hebrews chapter 7, we're told that we have a high priest in verse 25 who ever lives to make intercession for us, that he is a high priest in verse 26 who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, made higher than the heavens. In fact, he is the high priest that we're told in verse 17 of Hebrews 7 is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. He is Jesus Christ. And yet, you see, we're told also here in Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 11 that if perfection, if completion, if the full arrival at what God was aiming at was by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, we're told here in verse 11. What further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? Melchizedek, as this explained here in Hebrews chapter 7, you can go back to Genesis 14 where Melchizedek was the one who received the tithes of Abraham. And we're told, Paul explains in Hebrews 7, that was none other than Jesus Christ as he manifested himself. The Word, as he manifested himself there to deal with Abraham. Hebrews 7 explains that Melchizedek was without father, without mother, without beginning of days or end of life, that he abides a priest continually. His name means King of Righteousness and King of Peace. That can refer to none other than Jesus Christ. Now, understanding that, let's look at, we operate today in the Church of God today in the administration of the Spirit and the administration of Jesus Christ, a priest of the order of Melchizedek. Now, where did the Levitical priesthood come from? If you go back to the Old Testament, you go back to the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 19, God proposed a covenant to Israel that they would be a special people and he would be their God and their protector. And they assembled around Mount Sinai, and in Exodus chapter 20, we have God speaking. And the very voice of God, or the one who actually was the Word, that member of the God family, the one that became Jesus Christ, his voice literally shook, and he proclaimed the Ten Commandments, which was the basis of the Old Covenant. Moses then explained and expounded in Exodus 21, 22, and 23 statutes and judgments which were civil applications of the principles of the Ten Commandments to a physical nation, a civil nation. Then in Exodus 24, Moses and the elders of Israel went up part way into Mount Sinai and literally ate a banquet there in the presence of the God of Israel. And then Moses proceeded on up the mountain to be in the presence of God for 40 days. When he came back down the mountain, you remember the story, he came back down the mountain, the people were whooping it up. He'd been gone 40 days, and in that length of time, they had totally broken the covenant. They had disregarded everything they said, "We will do." And so he came down the mountain, and here they were whooping it up, dancing around the golden calf, having a regular orgy. Moses threw down and shattered the tables of stone, symbolizing the fact that they had absolutely shattered the covenant that they had made. He took the golden calf, ground it to powder, put it in the water, and made them drink it. And he said, "Who is on the Lord's side?" And the Levites came over to where he was. And he said, "Draw your swords and go execute the ringleaders," which they then proceeded to do. You don't read of a Levitical priesthood prior to that time. Levi was separated aside. The whole tribe of Levi at that time was separated aside. And there was an administration of death that was exacted. Now, there were aspects of worship, a whole system of worship. God gave Moses instruction in the mount for the building of a tabernacle, for all of the articles of furniture. Now that is laid out here in Hebrews chapters 8 and 9 and 10. We find in Hebrews 8 that Jesus Christ, let's notice here in verse 1 that Paul says, "We have a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, that he is a minister of the true sanctuary." And we're told in verse 3 that every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. Now, what did Jesus Christ do? Well, we're going to see that. He offered himself as one sacrifice for sin forever. Here in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5, we're told that the articles of furniture, all of the things that pertain to the worship of God under the Levitical administration of the Old Covenant, was to serve, verse 5, unto an example and shadow of heavenly things. Moses was told of God to make the tabernacle and to make it according to the pattern God had showed him. You see, God establishes the pattern for worship. The only way to worship the Father in an acceptable way is to worship Him in spirit and in truth. God is the one who reveals truth. God establishes the pattern. And even in the physical sense, He gave Moses the pattern for worship. Now we find as we come on down here in Hebrews chapter 8 verse 6 that Jesus Christ has obtained a more excellent ministry than that of Moses, and He's the mediator of a better covenant. Why was it a better covenant? The new covenant is clearly better than the old. Why? Is it because it was established upon better law? No, that's not what it says. It was established upon better promises. The promises of the new were better than the old. If the first covenant had been faultless, there would have no place been found for the second. So the first covenant had a fault. What was the fault? Was the fault with God? Was it with the law? No. Verse 8, for finding fault with them, with the people. God says, behold, the days come, I'll make a new covenant. In this new covenant, we're told in verse 10, the new covenant that God is going to make, is He says, I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. And I'll be to them a God, and they'll be to me a people. So here we find that God proposed to make a new covenant which involved not doing away with the law, but writing the law in the hearts and minds of those with whom that new covenant was being made. Now, we're told on down in chapter 9 here of Hebrews, verse 1, that the first covenant had ordinances, or it had ceremonies of divine service. It had a worldly sanctuary. There were certain aspects, certain ceremonies, and it describes, Paul talks about the tabernacle and the candlestick and the showbread and all of these various things. And he goes through and he describes it. And he said that these things were established. And he describes about entering into the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And all of these things had significance. The fact that the high priest was the only one allowed to go into the Holy of Holies we're told in verse 8, that by this the Holy Spirit was signifying that the way into the holiest of all, direct access to the Father, was not yet made manifest. It wasn't yet available during the time of that first tabernacle, during the time of the Levitical administration of the Old Covenant. These things, verse 9, these were figures for the time then present. These were things to illustrate spiritual truth. There were offered there gifts and sacrifices that could not make those that did the service perfect. They could not solve the problem. What was the problem? The problem was the people had broken the covenant. The people had transgressed the law. The people had sinned. And the wages of sin is death. Now, there was a cleansing that was needed. There was a change that was needed. There was a transformation that was needed, if you will. And yet, what we find right here is the fact that that system could not solve the problem. It pointed out the problem. It illustrated the problem. It demonstrated by the very rituals and ceremonies through which they went that there are things that separate us from God, that interfere with our relationship with God, that the wages of sin is death, that without the shedding of blood there is no remission of sin. But they couldn't solve the problem. All of these ceremonies, you see, the things that operated under that covenant, as we read in Hebrews 9:1, the ceremonies of divine service. What are we told here in verse 10? See, people sometimes want to know, well, how do you know which laws apply and which ones don't? Tells us right here in verse 10. These things stood only in meats or foods. Meat is used here in the older English sense of the word food. It included grain as well as flesh, which stood only in meats and drinks, or the food offerings, the drink offerings, the libations, as they were offered, the diverse washings, different washings, and the carnal ordinances, or the physical ceremonies and rituals which were imposed upon them until the time of Reformation. This is the entire list. This is the list of what was temporarily added. What was temporary? It was not a part of the Old Covenant. You know, you can go back to Deuteronomy, just very quickly here. We'll just note, Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 13 says, He declared unto you His covenant, which He commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments. And He wrote them upon 2 tables of stone. What was in the Ark of the Covenant? The 2 tables of stone that contained the 10 commandments. That was the basis of the Old Covenant. That's the basis of the New Covenant. That was the basis of the covenant God made with Abraham. You can go back and read that in Genesis 17:1. God told Abraham, He said, when Abraham was, or Abram as his name was at that time, when he was 99 years old, the eternal God appeared to him and He said, walk before me and be you perfect. Be complete, wholehearted, sincere. Walk before me and be you perfect. Now, what did Abraham understand that to mean? Well, Genesis 26:5, when God was reiterating the covenant to Isaac, what did He tell him? He said, I'm going to give you these things. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you the things that I swore to Abraham, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, and my statutes. Abraham kept the law. When God said, Abraham, walk before me and be you perfect, what did Abraham understand that to be? He understood that he was supposed to obey God. He was supposed to keep the commandments. You see, God's law is the basis of, that reflects the way God thinks. So, we're told right here that the things that were temporary had to do with the food offerings, the flesh and grain sacrifices that were made, the food offerings, the drink offerings, the libations poured out before the altar, the various different washings. You see, anytime someone became polluted, they touched a dead body or they came in contact with something that ceremonially defiled them, they were then excluded from the camp. And they had to wash, and then the water of purification that the priest administered was dispensed, and they were allowed to come back in. This, of course, illustrated the point that the uncleanness is not acceptable. God doesn't dwell in the midst of unclean things. And so the people had impressed upon themselves the need to be clean. There were all of these various ritual washings that were carried out, and there were various physical ceremonies that all pertain to the Levitical administration. You see, the Levites were chosen to administer the Old Covenant, and they administered death. These things were added until the time they were imposed, until the time of Reformation. When you read in Galatians 3:19 about the law that was added because of transgressions until the seed should come, this is what it's talking about. That was the only law that was added. You know, you can't have transgressions unless you first have a law. You have to start with a law in order to have transgression. So the law of God, the spiritual law of God, the 10 Commandments were in force and effect from the beginning. But because of transgressions, and we just rehearsed that story, you know, they had entered into a covenant agreement with God at Mount Sinai. Then they had transgressed the covenant grossly, through idolatry and through all of these things. And so then an administration was added. It was imposed upon them, and it consisted of all of these various things. But we're told now that Jesus Christ, verse 11 of Hebrews chapter 9, has become a high priest of good things to come. Not here in a physical tabernacle, and he doesn't enter in by the blood of bulls and goats, verse 12, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place and obtained eternal redemption for us. And he talks about in verse 13 that if the blood of bulls and of goats, the ashes of a heifer, if that's sanctified to the purifying of the flesh, if that made someone acceptable to come back into the camp of Israel, how much more, verse 14, shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So what do we find right here? Jesus Christ offered himself without spot to God, and the sacrifice of Christ makes possible the cleansing of the inner person, cleansing our conscience. You see, what really excludes us and defiles us and separates us from God is not the physical uncleanness or contamination that comes from having touched a dead body. That, certainly those laws, there was a hygienic aspect, but they were physical laws to teach spiritual lessons. And what we find when they were excluded from the camp and they had to take the water of purification and go through these rituals in order to come back in, that didn't clean the conscience. That didn't change the inner person. So this is why we have the mediator, verse 15, of a new covenant, a New Testament. And he, by means of his death, he made possible the redemption of transgressions that were under the first covenant, the first testament. They which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. You see, under the new covenant, the problem has the possibility of being solved. The problem that excluded man from the presence of God. Now, as we come on down, we find that all of these things were patterns, and that Jesus Christ, verse 28, was once offered to bear the sins of many. Chapter 10 tells us in verse 1 that the law had a shadow of good things to come. This was all of the law that pertained to the priesthood. You see in Hebrews 7 when we read where there is a change of the priesthood, there is a change of the law. What law? The law that pertains to the priesthood. If you change the priesthood from the order of Levi to the order of Melchizedek, then the administration, the whole structure of the priesthood, the laws that pertain to the priesthood directly, there's a change in those laws because now you have a different priesthood. You know, sometimes people come up with questions and they say, well, you know, do we just pick and choose from the Old Testament? No. You see, the laws that pertain to the food offerings, the drink offerings, the various ritual washings and the physical ceremonies that were carried out in the context of the Levitical administration, those things were temporary. They were intended to be temporary. But what we also find is that what is described right here, that in the laws pertaining to the priesthood, You see, that was the change that took place. We're told here in chapter 10, verse 1, the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of those things, can never, with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually, make the comers thereunto perfect. They could not solve the problem. They pointed it out, they illustrated it, but they could not solve the problem. Otherwise they would have ceased to be offered if they solved the problem. No, verse 3, in those sacrifices there was a remembrance again made of sin every year. It's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sin. So we find in verse 9 that we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Jesus Christ, our sacrifice, our high priest, who, as we're told in verse 12, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God. He's preparing to return as King of Kings and as Lord of Lords. Jesus Christ came to resolve the problem. He is the mediator of a new covenant. Now let's go back to 2 Corinthians with this sort of setting the stage that we have undergone a transformation from a covenant that was based upon the Ten Commandments, but it was based upon an obedience, a literal obedience to exactly what it said. It was the people were promised physical inheritance of the promised land, and they broke the covenant. They failed to carry it out. There was a Levitical priesthood that was established to administer the death penalty and to administer a system that illustrated the solution but did not really resolve the problem, because the blood of bulls and goats couldn't resolve it. Now Jesus Christ came to offer one sacrifice for sins forever. He's our high priest. He is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And I'd started to mention before, in terms of picking and choosing laws, some people say, well, we fast on the Day of Atonement, but we don't blow a trumpet on the Feast of Trumpets. Why is that? Well, the answer is very simple. God commands the people. He commands all of His people to fast on the Day of Atonement, and so we do. There's no commandment to the people to blow the trumpet. The Levites, the Levitical priesthood, sounded the shofar in conjunction with the tabernacle and the temple. They were the only ones authorized to sound the shofar. The people didn't sound the shofar. That was instruction to the priesthood. Now, there's been a change of the priesthood, so the laws that pertain to the priesthood have therefore had to undergo a change. Now, let's come on down, because we're not under that administration. Now, let's notice what Paul explains in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. He tells us in verse 4 of 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that such trust have we through Christ to Godward. Our trust is directed to God. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves. Our sufficiency is of God, who has made us able ministers of the New Testament. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. The letter kills, the Spirit gives life. If the administration of death, written and engraved in stones, was glorious, that law that was given all the way back at Mount Sinai, that finally, as you read on back in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 27, that when they came into the promised land, they literally plastered on the side of a mountain and inscribed the book of the law. There was a law that was engraved in stone, the whole book of the law. You can read about it back in Deuteronomy chapter 27. Now, what are we told? If that administration, the administration of death, because there were civil penalties that were applied to transgressions of the law, and the Levites were to administer that. If that was glorious, you see, when that was originally given and Moses came down the mountain, his face radiated from having been in the presence of God. If that was glorious, the people couldn't even stand to look. It just terrorized them when Moses came down the mountain and his face radiated. If that was the case, verse 8, how shall not the administration of the Spirit be rather glorious? The administration of the letter of the law, there was a glory that was attached to that. Moses, in receiving those instructions of how that was to be carried out, came down radiating. If that was glorious, how much more shall the administration of the Spirit? Because this was an administration of condemnation. This was an administration when the law was given, it was made apparent that the people transgressed the law. They fell short. And once they had, there were penalties to be exacted. And they were under the death penalty, and the old covenant did not solve the problem. It pointed to the solution, or let's say the administration of the Levites, their administration of the old covenant pointed toward the solution, but it didn't have the solution to the problem built in. Couldn't pay for sin with the blood of bulls and goats. So we're told that in verse 11 says, that which was done away was glorious, much more that which remains. We'll see Moses' glory faded over a period of a few weeks. And the administration, the Levitical administration of the Old Covenant, the administration of death also faded. But now, you see, while Moses the children of Israel couldn't look at Moses, he actually put a veil over his face. You can read about it back in Exodus chapter 34. And that symbolized the fact, as it brings out in verse 14, Paul says, to this very day, the people's minds are blinded. And there's a veil over their understanding. The veil that is untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament. They never got the point. The Pharisees of Christ's day, who were meticulous in their observance of the law, never got the point. Now, what is the spirit of the law? The spirit is what enlivens. It's what energizes. The spirit of the law involves the real intent, the enlivening, motivating, underlying principle of the law. Now, I want to show you, as we proceed on, having sort of set the stage a little bit, I want to show you exactly what is the spirit of the law. We don't have to just let our imaginations wander, because Jesus Christ came as the mediator of a new covenant, and He explained and expounded that new covenant and made plain for us. What is the spirit of the law? Notice what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. This is pretty fundamental. This is the Sermon on the Mount. You can't get much more New Testament than this. And Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, told those that were there listening to Him, don't think that I've come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And so some people read that and they think, oh, He didn't come to destroy the law or the prophets. He came to do away with it. Now, what sense does that make? Well, it doesn't make very much. What does the word fulfill mean? Just hold your place and let's go back here to Matthew chapter 13 a little bit. Verse 48, just want to show you one illustration. Here's exactly the same Greek word that's used here in verse 17 of Matthew 5. It's translated fulfill. Now let's notice the same words used back here a few pages later, Matthew 13, 48. Or let's pick it up in verse 47. He's talking about the kingdom of heaven is likened to a net cast into the sea, gathered every all kinds of fish. When it was full, verse 48, they drew it to shore. And they sat down and gathered the good into vessels, cast the bad away. The word translated full here, same word as fulfill. When they drew the net in, was it empty? Well, of course not. Did it have any fish in it? Of course it did. It was full of fish. When Jesus Christ said, don't think I've come to destroy the law. I've come to fill it up to the full. Truly I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot or one tittle shall in any wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled, brought to its fullness. Now, whosoever shall break one of these least commandments and teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Didn't even say he was going to be there. It said he'll be called least. Whoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. I say unto you, except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, Christ began to explain how could their righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. What did He mean by that? Did He mean they had to keep the Sabbath more carefully? Did He mean they had to tithe more scrupulously? Well, the Pharisees were doing those things, at least in one sense. Now, we're going to see the Pharisees were breaking the spirit of the law. They never got the point. What is the spirit of the law? Well, notice. Jesus Christ, here in Matthew 5, we're going to look at 7 illustrations that Jesus Christ gave. He selected out 7 different laws or commandments or statutes from the Old Testament. He quoted it and he demonstrated the spirit of the law, and we're going to look, here's 7 cases. Notice here, in verse 21, he says, you've heard that it was said by them of old time, you shall not kill. Now, you know where that was said? Well, that's part of the 10 Commandments, back in Exodus chapter 20. Whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. So, there is a penalty to be exacted. You've heard that, you shall not kill. Now, what do you think God was after on that? Do you think that means, well, you can beat him almost to death, but as long as he lived, well, that's okay? What was God after? You see, Jesus Christ quotes a law. He says, you've heard it said, verse 22, but I say unto you. Jesus Christ quotes from the law, from the Torah, and then he expounds the spirit of the law. He said, you've heard, don't kill. It's not enough just to refrain from murdering him. He says here that if you have an attitude of the spirit of murder, this attitude of absolute contempt, said if you say unto your brother, verse 22, Raka, you'll be in danger of the council. Whosoever shall say, you fool, you absolute contemptible individual that have no right to live upon this planet. Because the original carries really a stronger connotation than just what we think of in English. He says, if you say that, you're in danger of hellfire. If you bring your gift to the altar and remember your brother has aught against you, you better go and be reconciled. Because you see, if there is the spirit of murder, the spirit of animosity and resentment and hostility, there are people who don't commit murder simply because they're afraid of the consequences. They know that most likely they'll be caught and maybe sent off to jail or executed. There are people who restrain themselves from carrying out the physical act that in their minds they would really like to do if they thought they could get away with it. That's not good enough. Jesus Christ explained the spirit of the law, the spirit of the law, and he starts out with two commandments. He takes, don't kill and don't commit adultery. And he illustrates the point. He didn't try to go through, and here's to understand with the spirit of the law. You see, the spirit of the law is not a list of 749 do's and don'ts. It's not a list of 5,000, points and rules that you can turn to in every case and have every detail spelled out, because the spirit of the law involves learning to think the way that God thinks. Having the law written in our hearts and in our minds means we're learning to think the way God thinks. God has big plans for us, brethren. Those plans are that we are called to His kingdom and to His glory. We're to inherit all things. And if we're going to be sons of God, if we're going to be kings and priests, a part of the very family of God, then we have to learn to think as God thinks. So Christ explains the spirit of the law. He said, you've heard it said, don't kill. I'm telling you, I'm explaining to you, the whole point is, don't have a spirit of hostility, resentment, retaliation, revenge, animosity, hatred. Don't have the spirit of murder and harbor that within you. Comes on down in verse 27, he says, you've heard it said by them of old time, don't commit adultery. I say unto you, whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. See, Christ said, it's not enough just to refrain from the physical act. Yes, you're supposed to refrain from the physical act, but He said, I say to you, I'm explaining, here's what God is after. It's not just the fact that you stop just short. It's that you understand that it involves a way of thinking, the attitude of lust. That is the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law goes beyond the letter. It's not enough just not to hate, not to kill. You're not to hate. You're not to have a spirit of retaliation and hatred and the spirit that breeds violence. You're not only not to commit adultery, you're not to harbor the spirit of lust. And you're to go to whatever lengths you have to in order to resolve that. He says, get rid of whatever stands in your way. Coming on down, in verse 31, it's been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. Now he's quoting from back in Deuteronomy 24. He said, but I say unto you, what's the spirit of the law? What do you think God was after? You think the only thing God was concerned about was that you fulfill all the legal technical details and then get rid of her? No. Christ said, look, here's the spirit of the law. You see, He which at the beginning made them male and female and said, they twain shall become one flesh. No, Jesus said, whosoever shall put away his wife except for the cause of fornication, porneia, gross immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that's divorced commits adultery. The spirit of the law is that God intended marriage to be permanent. Marriage was not something that was intended to be broken up at a whim. The spirit of the law is explained here. Goes beyond the letter. He said, you've heard that it was said by them of old time, verse 33. Here's a fourth illustration. Now Christ is quoting from some of the statutes. He starts out and he quotes two of the commandments. don't murder, and don't commit adultery. Now he begins to quote. We quoted from Deuteronomy 24, addressing divorce. And he says, the real spirit, the real intent was that God intended people to be married for life. Now, in verse 33, he says, you've heard that it has been said, you shall not forswear yourself. You're to perform all your oaths. But I say unto you, swear not at all. You see, what Christ said was, look, you've heard that you're to perform all your oaths. You're not to swear an oath and break it. Do you think that's all God's after? Boy, if you swear on a stack of Bibles and promise and take all sorts of oaths, well then you better do that, but the rest of the time you can lie? No, he said, look, really the spirit of the law is you need to tell the truth. The spirit of the law is God is after truth. I'm telling you, don't swear at all, because your swearing isn't really going to change anything. Verse 36, verse 37, let your communication be yea, yea, and nay, nay. Whatsoever is more than that comes of evil. If you have to distinguish between when you're telling the truth and when you're not, then you're already in trouble. The spirit of the law is truth. And if you always tell the truth, you don't have to make some big production and distinction about, I'm really telling the truth this time. If you can just consistently say yes when you mean yes and no when you mean no, then your word is sufficient. You see, that's truth. The spirit of the law is God is after truth. He comes on down, verse 38. Here he uses a fifth illustration. You see, he had quoted the verse here about not forswearing yourself from Leviticus 19, verse 12. On down here in verse 38, he quotes the scripture, you've heard that it was said by them of old time, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now this is quoted, you can find it several places in Exodus 21:24 and Leviticus 24:20, Deuteronomy 19:21. What does that mean, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Well, if you go back and look it up and read it in its context, it was talking about the fact of fairness, that the punishment had to fit the crime. It had to do with the way the law was to be administered in ancient Israel. That things were to be, that they were to concentrate on being fair. Being fair. What Christ said is, look, the spirit of the law is not just the fact, all right, I'm going to get even, I'm going to get everything that is mine. Now, again, if you go back and you read the law in the context in the Old Testament, it was not talking about private personal revenge. People ought to just go around gouging each other's eyes out. It was talking about the principle, the means by which the law was to be applied in ancient Israel. But you see, people had that and they said, boy, I want what's coming to me. I want what's fair. I'm not going to put up with that. I don't deserve that. That sort of sounds like our society, doesn't it? Well, Christ said, look, I'm telling you, the spirit of the law is not only that it's not just enough to be fair. Say, well, I'm not going to put up with, I don't have to put up with that. I don't, that's not fair. No, what Christ said was, I say unto you that you resist not the evil, speaking of the evil one and authority. And he talks about the fact of an attitude of not demanding fairness, but a willingness to accept injustice. A willingness to have a forgiving attitude, an attitude of mercy, an attitude of going above and beyond. Not an attitude of I'm going to exact exactly what I'm entitled to. The spirit of the law goes beyond fairness. It goes to a willingness to put up with things that aren't fair. To look to God as our defender, our protector. To have an attitude of compassion and of mercy. Then we find, he says in verse 43, you've heard that it's been said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, you're not going to find that quotation, hate your enemy, in the Old Testament, but some deduced from the fact that they ought to love their neighbor that meant they could hate their enemy. Christ said, I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for those that despitefully use you. You see, the spirit of the law, you shall love your neighbor. You remember when the young man, or actually one of the lawyers, one of the scribes, he asked Christ, he said, now what is the great commandment of the law? And Christ said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Remember the fellow's response? He agreed with it. He said, that's right. He said, who is my neighbor? Now the Pharisees could get in great drawn out discussions about trying to determine who was their neighbor. Who's your neighbor? Is it the guy that lives right across the street from you, right next door to you, in your block, in your neighborhood, in your village, in your town, in your city, in your state, in your nation? Who is your neighbor? Well, Christ told the parable that we're very familiar with, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And He made the point. He said, you know who your neighbor is? Your neighbor is whomever you come in contact with. Anybody you come in contact with. At that point, he's your neighbor. And you need to love your neighbor as yourself. And maybe your neighbor is an enemy. And you need to love him too. Why? Verse 45, that you may be children of your Father which is in heaven. He makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the just and the unjust. If you, only people you love are the people that are nice to you, well, you're no different than anybody in the world. No, the whole point, verse 48, be you therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. The whole point of the spirit of the law is that we learn to think like God. That we go beyond the letter. Christ didn't spiritualize away the law and say, well, you know, you can just sort of do anything. You can murder him as long as you have a good attitude. No. Christ said, look, the letter of the law that says don't kill or don't commit adultery or don't, put away your mate without having gone through proper legal procedure, or don't swear an oath and then break it, or don't go beyond what is fair in getting even or retaliating. Don't mistreat your neighbor. You think that that's all God is? What's God after? Christ explained that it involved a way of learning how to think and act and feel. He explained the spirit of the law. Now I said 7. We've seen 6 illustrations. Christ picked out 6 different points right here that we have that we have illustrated, and he picked those out, but the scripture, you shall love your neighbor, that comes from Leviticus 19:18. So he picked out these various laws and principles and he illustrated the spirit of the law. He filled them up to the full. He didn't come to destroy it. He didn't come to do away with it. He came to fill it up to the full, to magnify the intent and the purpose. Now let's go on back a little further, because there is a 7th law that Christ illustrated the spirit of. He did this by example as well as by teaching. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 1, we find that Jesus came on the Sabbath day through a field of grain. And the disciples were hungry. And they began to pluck off these ears of grain and roll them around in their hand, get the grain off and eat it. And they were walking back into Jerusalem from a short distance away where they had spent the night. Now the Pharisees saw them do it. And they got all bent out of shape, and they said, your disciples are doing that which is not lawful on the Sabbath. Now, what were they doing that was unlawful? Well, the Pharisees considered that they were violating several of the laws. They had deduced all sorts of laws about the Sabbath. And one of the things that they had deduced was you shouldn't harvest on the Sabbath. So far, so good. I think anybody's ever been a farmer. I grew up on a farm, and you can be out in the field all day. That's pretty hard work. Well, the Pharisees they weren't satisfied with just saying you shouldn't harvest your fields on the Sabbath. They had to define what is harvesting. And so they counted it up. You can't transport agricultural produce. Okay. Can't bear a burden. And that goes back, you can read back in Nehemiah and Jeremiah and other places where there were problems with people hauling in produce into Jerusalem. So the Pharisees had deduced, they had come with a tradition of the elders that anything above the weight of 3 dried figs constituted a burden. So they said, why, your disciples are breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus, who enjoyed answering questions by asking questions, particularly some they couldn't answer, and he said, haven't you ever read about David when he was hungry? Those that were with him, how he entered into the house of God, he ate the showbread. That wasn't lawful for him to eat, was it? Neither those that were with him, only for the priests. Haven't you read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? I say, in this place is one greater than the temple. If you had known what it means, I'll have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. He didn't say the disciples were guilty of breaking the Sabbath. He said they were guiltless. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He's Lord even of the Sabbath. And then he departed and he went into their synagogue, and there was a man that had a hand withered, and they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him? And he said, well, if you had a sheep and you get him out, here's a man, he's better than a sheep. It's lawful to do well. And so he told the man to stretch out his hand, and he healed it and restored it. And the Pharisees were so infuriated, they went out and held counsel how they might destroy him. Christ magnified the Sabbath, and what did he explain here? He used an illustration from the Old Testament, referring to David. Now, if you go back and you study about the showbread, that was the bread of presence. That was the bread that was in the tabernacle or later in the temple in the presence of God. It was in there, and then at the end of the week, the priests took it out. It had been there in the presence of God. The priests took it out, and then they were free to eat it and consume it, and new bread of presence was placed in the tabernacle. Now, David and his men showed up there, and they were quite hungry, and the priests had exchanged the bread, and they had taken the bread of presence out, and they had it there, and David asked for something to eat, and they said, you know, the only thing we have is the bread we've taken out of the tabernacle. The bread that God says we, as His priesthood, are now free to consume. That's the only thing we have. This is, you know, God did not want that bread treated. It had been bread in the presence of Him, and He didn't want it treated in a casual, careless way that would lead to a disrespect of God and what was holy. But you see, the priest understood something the Pharisees didn't understand. He understood how to apply the spirit of the law. He understood that what God was after is what is holy is to be treated as holy, and not to be treated in a common or a profane way. But he also understood that if somebody's hungry standing there and you're standing there and you know, you're chomping down on this bread and this guy is standing over here and he hadn't had a meal in 2 days, that's not really what God had in mind. And when they asked David and his men some questions and realized that these were men who were doing God's work, that they were men that were men of God, men who feared God and had not been involved in the wrong kind of thing. And they said, well, you know, we feel like God has given this to us, but we feel like that under the circumstances, we will share it here. We will give it to you and your men. They made a decision to give away what God had given to them for a legitimate reason and purpose. Now, Christ and His disciples were walking through the grain field, and they were hungry, and they plucked off stuff, and they were eating it. They weren't out harvesting the field. They weren't transporting all sorts of stuff into Jerusalem to sell and trade. They fulfilled a need. You know, you're out. What's the whole point? You see, God tells us that the Sabbath commandment is we're to remember the Sabbath, we're to keep it holy, and we are to rest from our labors. That's what God wants us to do on the Sabbath. That's what He says. Now, the Pharisees had gotten so focused on all of these little minor do's and don'ts that they had lost sight of the whole picture. You know, you and your family travel a distance and come to church, and maybe whatever reason you didn't bring a lunch or didn't have one, you on your way back and you're hungry, and so you pull in and you get you pick up a sandwich, or you go someplace and you get something to eat. Are you breaking the Sabbath? You know, there's a difference between filling a hunger. You're hungry right then, and here you are, and you've driven to services or going, home from services. There's a considerable difference between that and somebody who's going out doing his week's grocery shopping on the Sabbath. No, Christ didn't say that He didn't say that the Sabbath is done away. He didn't say that you don't have to keep the Sabbath. He didn't say that one day is as good as another. He illustrated by His example that the principle of trying to of taking care of a legitimate need. He's not talking about people going out and performing a job and laboring and involving themselves in carrying out their commercial and industrial endeavors. He's talking about somebody that's hungry to get something to eat. He's talking about someone here that here was an individual that was sick and Christ healed him. Now, He didn't go around and try to set up shop and spend the entire Sabbath doing all these things, but here was something that he came in contact with and he understood. You see, that when you're confronted with a problem or with an emergency or with something where someone is in pain or in need and there's something you can do at that moment, that is right in harmony with what God is talking about. We might just show you another, a parallel example that explains a little bit more back in Luke chapter 6. Luke 6 verse 1 gives the same account, gives a parallel account, and it adds in a detail. Luke 6 verse 1, it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first. Now, if you check that up, you find that this term, Sabbaton Deuteroproton, which means the first Sabbath. Very likely, most likely, I think, that refers probably to to the last day of unleavened bread, the second Sabbath of first rank in the year, the first Sabbath. That's the term that's used in the Greek, the first Sabbath. You can get in different ones may have slightly different interpretations of what that means, but I think most likely that it is a reference to the second high day, which would be the last day of the days of unleavened bread. And they were coming back through the fields and they plucked these ears of corn. And you have the account. And Christ went through those things. And he brings out in verse 5, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. And then he entered into the Sabbath, into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he taught. So what do we find on here? We find Christ demonstrating an example of attending services. We find that Christ had an attitude and an approach that he demonstrated as to how do you fulfill the spirit of the law when it comes to the Sabbath. There's nothing here that illustrates where Christ was telling people to go out and work at their jobs, where he was telling them to forget what the Sabbath means. And anybody that says, well, I can keep the Sabbath sort of sitting out in the boat fishing. I'm sure. No, you can't. You can't, you don't keep the Sabbath sitting at the ball game or out in the park fishing or out in the field hunting or whatever it is. You never find an example where Jesus Christ was doing something like that. The example that he gave was somebody that was hungry and got something to eat, that satisfied the hunger of the moment, not that they were spending the day in the field harvesting. It involved a healing of a man that was sick. It involved being there at services. Christ demonstrated either by word or by example 7 different principles of the spirit of the law. Now it's interesting, one of the reasons I wanted to go to Luke 6 was if you come on in this context in Luke 6, he brings out, when you come on over to verse 20, you see the beginning of the Beatitudes and what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Luke 6 combines together Christ's amplifying the spirit of the law pertaining to the Sabbath with the events surrounding the Sermon on the Mount, which we have in greater detail back in Luke's account. So the point is, here we have 7 different laws, 7 different 3 commandments and 4 statutes that Jesus Christ, by word and by deed, amplified and expounded the spirit of the law, the intent. What's God after? What is it that God really wants? Now, let's go on. That's I think the crux of what we want to look at, but let's look at a couple of other examples let's look at how Paul illustrated the spirit of the law when we're studying the Old Testament. In effect, the testimonies. You know what testimony is? That's something that's borne witness of. That's a record that is borne witness of. And Paul illustrates and explains the Old Testament. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul explains, he said, now brethren, I don't want you to be ignorant about all our fathers that were under the cloud. They were baptized unto Moses. Verse 3, they did eat the same spiritual meat, drink the same spiritual drink. They drank of that spiritual rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. God wasn't well pleased with many of them. A lot of them died in the wilderness. Verse 6, now these things are our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they lusted, neither be idolaters as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. That's describing the events back in Exodus chapter 32, the big production they had with the golden calf. When it says they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, he's not talking about volleyball either. You can go back and read that in Exodus 32. They had a regular orgy. So he describes that, and he says, verse 8, neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ as some of them tempted and were destroyed of the serpents. Neither murmur you as some of them murmured and were destroyed. Now all these things happened to them for examples. They happened as types. And they're written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the age are come. If you understand the spirit of the law, when you study the examples in the Old Testament, Paul gave an illustration of how to apply those stories. You see, they are literal historical accounts of what happened, but they're recorded not just to tell us history, but they contain lessons. God preserved certain records to be written down and preserved for us. When you read the examples and the illustrations of children of Israel in the wilderness or various things, when you read that, what is it God wants you to get? Just a collection of names and dates and places and technical information about this fella did this and this one did that? Well, you have to have a certain amount of that to sort of facts to be able to hang the story on, as it were. But the spirit of the law, you see, Paul said, these are examples, these are illustrations. God selected accounts to have preserved so that we might learn lessons. We might understand cause and effect. We might see the kinds of problems people get into. We might see how people reason themselves astray. We might see all kinds of lessons that we can apply to our lives. When you read the Old Testament, if you understand the spirit of the law, then you are studying those examples so that you might learn how to please God. So that we might learn from the example and the illustration of what people did and how God responded. You know, some people take the approach that if you can't show them chapter and verse that says, thou shalt not, well, it must be okay. Well, brethren, there are a lot of things that you can't necessarily show chapter and verse for, but you can show everything covered in principles. You know, you can't. You can't show a verse that says, thou shalt not snort cocaine. But you can certainly illustrate the principle. You know, God says, be not drunk with wine wherein is excess. There's a principle that's illustrated. The spirit of the law is God does not want, look, God intends that in our lives we bear the fruits of the Spirit. You need your mind in order to bring your thoughts under control and subjection. You need your mind alert in order to bear the fruits of God's Spirit. And anything that interferes with your ability to bear the fruits of the Spirit is obviously a violation of the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is the intent. That is the purpose. Paul explains how to glean the spirit of the law from all of the examples and illustrations that we have. When you go through and you read about Abraham, or you read about Joshua, or you read about the children of Israel and their progression through the wilderness, we're reading examples that ought to help us, because there ought to be lessons that we can apply in our own lives. We need to utilize the fact that the models and the examples that are recorded in the Old Testament, if we grasp the spirit of the law, we understand that the things that happen serve as models and as illustrations, as examples by which we can learn. So, that's one way that Paul explained the spirit of the law, in explaining how to read and study the Old Testament and glean from it the spirit of the law. Now let's notice there was a problem that Paul dealt with. And let's notice how he dealt with this problem. It's a problem that has shown up in various times all through human culture because human nature is such that people do not naturally perceive a balance of and by themselves, and the tendency of human nature is, of course, to be enamored with whatever the current fad and fashion, and we want to fit in with the world. You can go through the Scriptures all the way through and you find that there's always been a problem with people of God having their identity eroded away. And you can look through various examples of whether Israel in the wilderness or on down to the, through the period of the judges and the kings and on down to the time of the restoration, in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, and you find over and over again this was always a problem. Paul was evidently contending with a problem, or Timothy had contacted Paul about a problem, because there were extremes of fashion that were gone to in that society, just as there have been in virtually every society. And so Paul was giving Timothy some instructions about how to handle the problem. Now let's notice what Paul emphasized. What Paul emphasized, what he told Timothy to emphasize, was the spirit of the law. You see, that involves explaining the principle so people can get the point. Not just a matter of legislating out every tiny detail. Paul says, we'll pick it up here in 1 Timothy 2, verse 8. Paul says, I will that men everywhere pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness, or an approach or a spirit of humility, of humble-mindedness, as it were, and sobriety, not with this evidently some particular style of where gold and pearls and things like this were braided into the hair and this big elaborate production. This sort going to excess here. Verse 10, but that which becomes women professing godliness with good works. Now, notice what he says right here. He says modest apparel. He didn't say, all right, now Timothy, it's got to be, this is the exact length. He didn't define in great detail. He didn't spend pages determining exactly what is and is not modest in every circumstance. He gave a principle. Years ago, I was in the ministry, as a young minister, and I had the phone ring one time, and it was a lady on the other end of the phone, and she said, look, says, I want to ask her, I've got a question. I'm going to the beauty shop, and I want to know exactly what vertebrae of the neck does my hair have to come to? And I said, well, lady, I said, I don't even know how many vertebrae you've got in your neck. I've never counted. I don't know. I've never really thought about that. I said, but there are principles that are involved. You can go back to 1 Corinthians 11, and it talks about it's a glory to a woman to have long hair, and it's a shame to a man to have long hair. There are principles. You see, Paul addressed a problem, an issue that had come up, and people were going to extremes. How does God want His people to look? He didn't spend pages and pages giving a detailed list of everything that is permitted and is prohibited. But it's pretty obvious if somebody is decked out and looks like a New Orleans streetwalker, that's not the way God wants His people to look. He doesn't want them to look like a Bourbon Street hooker. No, modest apparel, he says. Now see, there's a principle. There's a principle. God inspired Paul to explain a subject. It had to do, how did Paul address the problem? He pointed them to the spirit of the law. What is it God wants? What's God after? You see, the point, brethren, God is preparing us to join Him in His family forever. He's calling us to participate in His glory and in His kingdom. And He's giving us an opportunity to learn to think as He thinks, to have His laws written in our hearts and in our minds. The administration of the Melchizedek priesthood, Jesus Christ is the Melchizedek priesthood. The ministry, by the way, we're not priests. The Bible calls us stewards of God. A steward is one who's responsible for taking care of his master's property. Jesus Christ is going to return, and He's going to demand accountability of His stewards. Now, the priesthood of the New Testament church consists of Jesus Christ. There's one mediator between God and man. And that's Jesus Christ. He is the Melchizedek priesthood. And He inspired and approached the administration of the new covenant. And we're told to be ministers of the new covenant. That involves the administration of the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law doesn't spiritualize away the law. No, it fills the law up to the full. It magnifies the full intent and purpose. God's purpose for us is that we become like Him, that we have His thoughts. You know, naturally our thoughts aren't His thoughts and our ways aren't His ways. God has given us the opportunity to learn His ways, to be filled with an understanding of His way of life. Jesus Christ picked out 7 different laws. And He illustrated the spirit of the law. What is the principle? What is the intent? What is God really after in each of these cases? Paul explained that we're to derive lessons from the examples we read in the Old Testament because that's what they are. They're examples. They illustrate life and life circumstances and proper and improper responses. And we are to study the Old Testament trying to understand the spirit of the law, trying to understand the principles and the examples that are illustrated and how they might apply to us. And when we confront problems, and when here Paul was instructing a young minister, confronting problems in the church and things that needed to be addressed, he said, direct the people back toward godly principles. What's God after? What does God want? How does God desire us to present ourselves? You know, some of these things may be physical things, but we are physical creatures. And ultimately, what's in our heart manifests itself. You know, John talks about that the world passes away and the lust thereof. All that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. It's not of the Father, but it's of the world. You see, the world is built on a false value system, a decadent value system. If we understand the spirit of the law, we don't need a Talmud spelling out every detail. But we understand what God's after. And we're striving to please God in everything. Whatsoever we do, do all to the glory of God. That ought to solve the problem if we really are focused on that, of the way we talk, the way we act, the way we present ourselves, the way we are in every facet of our lives and our endeavors, because we're striving to be like God. You know, we're told back in the book of Romans chapter 12, Romans chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2. The Apostle Paul writes, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service, and be not conformed to the world. Don't fit in and take your identity and your shape from this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We've been called to become like God. We've been called to have God's nature inscribed within us. We are to be a part of administering the new covenant, the spirit of the law. The 10 Commandments were the basis of God's covenant with Abraham, of God's covenant at Sinai, and of God's covenant with us. But what we have is not a Levitical ceremonial administration that merely illustrates the problem and the solution by the various ceremonies connected with the tabernacle. No, there's been a change of the priesthood, and therefore there has been a change of the law that pertains to the priesthood. There is a change of administration. The administration is the administration of the Spirit. Because God is preparing us to live as a part of His family forever. He tells us in Hebrews 2, what is man that you're mindful of him, or the son of man that you visit him? Made him a little lower than the angels temporarily, but he's been crowned with glory and set over the works of God's hands. And Paul tells us in Hebrews chapter 2 that in that He has put all under Him. Well, let's just read it here in Hebrews chapter 2. Verse 8, you've put all things in subjection under His feet. In that He put all in subjection under Him, He left nothing that's not put under Him. But now we see not yet all things. No, God's intent is that we inherit everything in all directions forever, as a part of the family of God, called to participate in God's glory and in His kingdom. Peter tells us that we're to be holy, as God is holy. We're to become like God. That's God's purpose and God's intent. The spirit of the law reflects the mind of God. And brethren, that's what we all need to strive to understand. It's not a matter of looking for loopholes when you read the Bible. It's not a matter of trying to reason and rationalize and see how far you can go. You know, it shouldn't be a matter that we just want to dabble our toe in the cesspool, maybe not fall all the way in to get as close as we can get. How far can you lean over the cliff without falling? Well, I don't know. I guess about the only way to find out is lean over far enough to fall, and on the way down you can figure out where you should have stopped. How far can you go? How far is too far? What God tells us is to be striving for the spirit of the law, the intent, the purpose. Understand what God's after, how God thinks, being not conformed to this world, not deriving our identity and our shape, trying to fit in as a part of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. The real transformation takes place on the inside as God's law is written more and more indelibly in our hearts and in our minds, as we're striving to think like God thinks, to have the mind of Christ, to respond as He would respond, so that we might, as a part of His family, live forever on into eternity.